everybody. Welcome to the Coach's Journey podcast. It's Robbie here with, again, for the first time in a while, the two Alexes. And this is, again, I know I've said this before when joined by co-hosts on the show, but this is one of those times I'm really grateful that there's people who can do this so that we can create a really nice episode for you today. The very exciting news is, in fact, I just sent it out to my mailing list today, which will tell you if you're on my mailing list when this was exactly recorded. And if you're not, you can feel a bit guilty now and you can go and sign up. I just sent out today the cover to people. So it's like the book is my new book, The Power to Choose, is becoming real. And what we're going to do in this conversation is we're going to explore that, and we're going to bring some relevance to it to coaches, but it's very relevant to coaches because really it's a book about mindset and about the kind of work we can do with clients, as we'll probably get into. So we'll make it relevant for you all, but we'll also have a chance to explore these ideas which have been a part of my psyche consciously in some form of a book for not more than 9 years now. And now, well, not now, I'm like still a little unsure if it's going to come out on the date I've got planned, but by the time you hear this, it's definitely out. It's out in the world. So that's very exciting for me. But yeah, I'm going to hand over to Alex Whitten now to kind of, and Alex Swale to run the episode from now on so that I don't have to be thinking about that. And most importantly, so that you don't have to hear my voice for like an hour and a half.
Although saying that, if I don't hear much of your voice, this might be a very interesting book interview. But yeah, hi Robbie and hi everyone. Thanks for having me, and really excited to hear more about The Power to Choose. Having felt privileged enough to read it already, as a human and as a coach, it feels like there's so much richness there. And you mentioned it's sort of 9 years plus in the making, Robbie. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that journey.
Yeah, I just got this flash then of I didn't actually check with you before this call. I mean, you both sent me nice emails, but I didn't check before we press record. Like, do you like the book? Or was it interesting for you? So it's a very big relief that you said that. Otherwise, again, be a very interesting book interview.
Welcome to the Robbie Swale roasting, everyone.
Exactly, yeah, it could be. Yeah, the story of the book on one level is a story of the power of coaching. Because sometime at the end of a coaching engagement in, I think, the start of September 2016, Joel Monk, who we had on the show back in episode 6 or something, who was coaching me at the time, asked me a question, and I know he did not think the answer was going to be this, because I didn't think the answer was going to be this. He said, let's say we meet up in December. And this is a great question that any coach listening can ask their clients at the end of an engagement. So let's say we meet up in 3 months. What's the thing you'd love to be telling me then? And I would guess he was thinking, because we've been working on my business and we've been working on some other stuff. I don't know what he thought I was going to say, but I definitely didn't expect. And it was kind of one of those moments as a client where I'm like, is that real? Is that true? Am I really going to say that? That I'd written a book was the thing that came out. And then, so that's what I'd love to be telling Joel in 3 months' time from September 2016. So Joel, it's been taking a little longer than that, but it's done now. It's done. And and then Joel asked something like, we had a conversation, and it can't have been long because I think it was towards the end of that final call. That's how I remember it. It might not be true like that, of course. He then asked some questions, and one of them was something like, because I was saying, but I don't know what, that's weird for me because it's not necessarily ever been my dream to write a book, which is funny because this is the 5th book now that's published. But it's never really been that conscious dream. And also, I don't know what it'd be about. And what he asked me was something like, what's the thing you're most curious about at the moment? And what I said was, whether this new worldview that something like this, maybe it wasn't exactly this language, but I think it was pretty close. Whether this new worldview that I've been creating for myself is valid. And that is basically what this book is. And we can talk more about where it came from, and how it evolved after that, and the role that Alex Swale played, which is a key one, true story, and all of that. But that's definitely the origin story of this book, although it was going to be called something different for most of the time. It looked very different when the first draft was completed about a year after that. There's plenty of ways we could probably jump off from there.
Well, starting there quickly, Rob, because I know that part 1 has been on your website for a while. What's the bit that went, right, now's the time to finish this?
Yeah. Well, it's been coming. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The draft versions of part 1, and they're similar, but have been worked up quite a bit since then. So there's whole sections in the book that aren't in there. There's some sections in there that aren't in the book. There's some bits. The most painful bit of people who have worked on big writing projects will know this. the most painful bits were the bits that needed to stay but be completely reworked, because that's much harder than writing from scratch. And in my view, and yeah, kind of the first about half of the book, slightly more than that now, has been online since 2020, because in the mayhem that was 2020 and 2021, when the world was turned upside down for so many people, me included, were asking, how can I help? Like, what have I got? And I realized I was sitting on this heavily worked up draft of this book, about how do you cope in uncertainty and complexity? Like, what are the mindsets that help us deal with, the subtitle of the book, right? How do we find calm and connection in the middle of total complexity? So that for people who haven't checked it out yet, the book title is The Power to Choose: Finding Calm and Connection in a Complex World. And so I put that out there then as part of my, it's almost ready. I think it was worked up at that point because I'd submitted it to some publishers and had a publishing offer on it. And so it was in a good state by that point. So I was like, I've got it. Like, I've got to get out of the way and put some of this out there. And partly, my guess would be that's why the whole book hasn't come out sooner, because part of my creative energy knew that some of those ideas were out in the world already. But yes, what was the impetus now? Well, keen listeners to the podcast will remember that in 2022, I credited Jennifer Garvey-Berger on the show with helping me realize that the ideas in The Power to Choose were valid, helping me answer that question. Is this worldview valid? Because of many of the themes in it came out in her work when I connected with it. And I promised in that in that episode 3 years ago, I think, to get it out that year, maybe the year after. And obviously neither of those things happened. So it's been around on my, so there's two ways of looking at it. It's been around on my Warren Buffett 5 and 25 things list, which clients of mine and people who listen to the show a lot will know is an exercise I use quite a lot, as one of the top 20 every year since 2016. But it's only made it into and it was in the top 5 for a while and was failed at, and then it made it back in this year. And the big reason for that, I think, Alex, really is it felt like a creative blockage, which is not the most romantic thing to say, but it felt like, I'm not sure I can do anything else. I'm not sure I can write another book while this one is still kind of in the system and not in the world. And then I had to sit down with myself and think, what am I going to do about that? Like, there's two options, right? I can write it off. I can, like, essentially delete it, although I probably wouldn't have ever done that. And that tells us something about where it was always going to end up. But I could have deleted it, right? And said, it's fine. It was 4 long, great blog posts on my website. That was a good use of time. It changed how I think. It changed, all these things. There's chapters that I've shared with, in fact, I think all the bits that are published have been shared with clients, occasionally, because something's come up and it's like, I think you might want to read this bit. Obviously in earlier draft form. I could either do that or I could publish it. I could get out of the way and actually, schedule it in and work it up and publish it. And part of what happened was I thought about what would Robbie Swale do. And I have a lot, the good thing about writing, all the books I've written have been books for me, and partially. And so I know what I think people should do if they're sitting on a work of art. And there are, people who've read the 12-minute method books know this, but they should share it, because you don't know how good it is if it's yours. And if I think about some of my favorite artists, music, novelists, all these kind of things, who had unpublished work they decided weren't going to publish, I'm just annoyed about that. I would have just rather heard those songs or read those books. I'm sure there's something for them, but it's and luckily one of my favorite authors luckily died. And after that, they got some of his books out and they published them, right? And so it's great, we got to read those books. Unluckily, he would have written 30 more by now that I could have read. And so I decided it had to come out. And then I sat down with it again to kind of double check. I think this is the order. I read it and I was like, yeah, it's good enough. So we can do it. And then I had to get down to big scale 12-minute method practice to actually get it done.
I wanted to, there was something about really, Robbie, that, other Alex here, also very excited to be here. It's funny, a preponderance of Alexes today. And one of the things for me, Robbie, and I don't know whether this at all ties in with the time it took to write it. It may not at all, but there was a real sort of high level of vulnerability, shall we say, in this book for me. And I think you're a person who, over the years, as I've engaged with you and I've read so many of the things you've put out, I think I've seen that ability to be vulnerable, that you put things out into the world where you'll talk about your own experiences. And certainly for me as a reader, and being able to give you the feedback for, of course, I love the book. I think that it was really important to me, and it really helped me understand things because you were explaining them from your perspective of having lived through them, rather than from some judgment of on high about the way other people should live their lives. But I was wondering what that was like for you. And I think there's a broad question here, and many of the things and the themes in the book opened up some really big, broad questions for me. There's some broad questions here around, the importance of being vulnerable, in order to perhaps share your best work and really connect with some of the things that you talk about in the book, perhaps like your higher self. I wonder what that experience was like for you. And just to give people some examples, in the relationship section, for example, Robbie talks about his past relationships and his current marriage, and I know that's a big deal. These are big things to speak about. So there's a lot packed in there, Robbie. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we do some like so in the book, because you just mentioned it, Alex, in the book, I use a kind of metaphor, slash language to describe a thing of the higher self. So that there might be that in a way, the way we find calm and connection in the complex world is we get more and more access to our higher self, which we could think about as kind of who we are on our best days, the more skillful and wise parts of us, and less the kind of reactive, more base parts of us. If I listen for the kind of higher part of me, that produces this work, like what I know is there can be no great work without some vulnerability, right? You can't really make anything worthwhile without it. And so that is it. It's a requirement, I think, personally. I mean, I think you can make arguments otherwise, and you could create, but maybe it's not really art. Maybe that's what I'm saying. So like you could create a really unvulnerable tactical explanation with nothing of a person in it, with only ideas. But I don't think it would touch people in the way that art does. And I guess what I'm saying in that is that, I think of this work that I do as art. But on the flip side of it, me as the human, yeah, it's a truly insane thing, Alex. And on some level, I wish I wasn't doing it. And partway through this process, I've thought, like, what am I doing? Why do I put myself in this situation? Like, what? I could have just deleted the book, as we've just said, and then I wouldn't have to go through this stuff. And I put in the acknowledgements for the book, thanks to everyone who contributed to the 12-minute method books, because I don't think I could have done this one if I hadn't practiced. Like, I don't think I could have handled all that vulnerability and resistance of not only this book, but also any book at once. But because I've done those, courage comes first, confidence comes after. I'm on the after of the 12-minute method book, so I have some confidence. And so I'm very grateful to everybody and all the encouragement with those books, because without them, I don't think this one could have come out. I'm sure, again, if you think about what me, the coach and author of the 12-minute method books, would say about those 9 years, right? I would say resistance. That's what happened, right? In lots of ways. And lots of other ideas were speech much more important. There were other things to do, all that kind of thing. And yet we made 100 and something episodes of this show over that time. So I've had plenty of time, right, that I could have given to this book, and I chose to give elsewhere. And so, yes, it is a part of it. It has been there's been a lot going on in life, as there often is in the last month or two for me. But I've had the reflection that this book and getting to this stage has disrupted my nervous system much, much more than I thought it would. I.e., the vulnerability has been a much bigger impact on me than I had imagined when I sat down and thought, nope, I'm going to do it because I know how to get a book out. And how hard can it be? And the answer is, emotionally and mentally, spiritually, quite hard. And it's really lovely to hear you say that, Alex, because I hope that that's the case, that the truth of the stories, the sense that this is not an on-high instruction, this is like a set of ideas collected and hard, and pulled together in a hard-won journey through life, comes across and makes it more real and more practical, because this isn't just a set of ideas, although it is a set of ideas. It's a set of ideas designed to be practiced. And so there is all of that. And honestly, I don't know, mostly on the other side of these things, I've found that the vulnerability that felt terrifying is fine. And And I'm very grateful that Emma is mostly patient with it, although she hasn't read this draft. I don't think I've added anything in since she read it, but I did have this little pang of like, man, she might read it and be like, no chance, mate. Let's pull this whole thing. She hasn't said that yet. Maybe she will before you all listen to this, and it'll be a completely different book. But and then I guess I think they would feel like there was one more thought. Although I've collected a lot of thoughts. It's a great prompt. Yeah, the last piece would be when I've done zone of genius work for myself, which I've only really done once. I've only ever felt the need to do it once. When I did that and asked the questions, like when I'm at my best, the questions in that work from Gay Hendricks are, when I'm at my best, what am I doing? And then what's the exact thing you're doing? And then what do you love most about that? The answers in there are about sharing myself with love with the world. And so, like, I know that that's the thing that creates the most abundance and satisfaction that I could essentially do all day. And so, although it feels very odd to many parts of me, here we are.
Alex Whitten, was there anything you wanted to say on that, in terms of relating to those themes of the vulnerability? Was that something you noticed? What did you think?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. As you were describing that, Robbie, it felt like there's actually maybe two parts to this book. One, that process of, is this new view I have valid? But as you describe that and the concepts in the book, almost feel like the book is the product of applying those concepts. How true does that feel to you? And like in that way, if so, how have those concepts supported you to bring this into the world?
Well, because you and I, Alex, both love Alex Whitten. Maybe Alex Swale does as well. I don't know. We both love the hero's journey, right? And in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the final part of the journey is you have to integrate the thing, and then you bring back whatever it is you've won to the place where you started, and you're more of an elder in the community, and you have something to offer. And so, if this is like an old story, myth, or Celtic myth or something, you probably bring back like the tree of life and you plant it in the middle of your village. Or if you're Erin Brockovich, you win the money for the people who have been scammed, and then you give it to them, right? And so there is a way in which, yeah, it does feel like that. It does feel like, and in some ways this is the story in the book, right? There's like a wake-up call for me, a call to adventure. Then there's a whole bunch of stuff. And then here we are with this thing at the end of it, which is a condensed version of that. And look, I guess I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but when I think about how much has this book helped me with publishing this book, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but the 12-minute method books have definitely helped me with the publishing of this book. And this book has helped me with the ideas in this book have helped me with basically everything, because for me, they're pretty foundational. Now, I don't think I sat down explicitly thinking of this stuff during the process, but these ideas now, because if you think about it, really they were there in 2016. They were baked into almost the form we've got now by 2020. They're actually quite different. They're not that fresh to me, if that makes sense. They're much more embedded. And then at the same time, I was running these meaningful productivity workshops this autumn, and as I was doing it, I was, so for people who haven't come across that, that's a newer framework that I created. Where essentially you can find this on my website, the robbieswale.com website. There's a download you can get called the Meaningful Productivity Blueprint. But essentially the idea in there is we can't manage time because it's just time, but we all tell ourselves we can, and that is a problem if we want to be more productive. So what do we do? Well, one of the things we do, we manage other things, and two of those things are we manage our attitude, like our mindsets, and we manage our relationships. And as I was running these workshops and working on the book at the same time, the bits where I was teaching about attitude management and relationship management were changed a lot, because I was like, well, this is a book almost entirely about attitude management and relationship management, right? That's that subtitle, Calm and Connection. And so everything from them, I was saying like, well, it's weird that this isn't integrated already into this other model I've got. So let's put it all in there. And for sure, those ideas and the stories in the book and other stories we could tell about those key ideas, they're everywhere, really.
There was something sort of, I don't know whether I'm going how tangentially in relation to this issue this is, but there was a bit in the book which really struck me, and so one of the interesting things about sort of coming across some of these concepts of some of these things is it's like there's a sort of palimpsest, there's like a memory in things, and so that I've sort of listened to it in different versions, and so there's some bits that when I read the book, the concepts seem familiar to me, either because I've read them, or sometimes maybe because I've seen them enacted in other things that you do, and because they're now embedded practices in the way that you live your life and interact with the world. And but there was one concept in particular that I think I probably need a lot more time to like unpack, and I wanted to ask you about. And there was it was an image of a castle. So it was basically, and this is where we're talking about, this is where it links, I think, to the vulnerability thing. And to try to explain it, so the purposes of answering the question, I'm sure you'll explain it better. It was the idea that there's parts of ourselves that we lock away as if they were a turret in a castle, because we were told at some point they were bad or unreasonable or not shouldn't be part of a good person, and perhaps we're growing up. But the issue in that is we can lock away whole parts of ourselves, which mean that we don't have access to things that actually might be useful to us and actually are things that we might want to cultivate or engage with. And so I think that's a really interesting concept for me, because if I'm trying to apply this to my own life, I think that sometimes I wonder, if you do that for exercise, and if it's sort of almost, there's a bit in the book about choosing your own adventure. If I'd been born into a different family or in a different country or in a different situation, what would my life have been like? And so I'm curious about the parts of myself which I would like to have access to and maybe don't. And listeners might be feeling the same or not even know what those parts might be. So as a concept and how it relates to you, could you explain a bit more about that? Because I love that idea.
Yeah. And then we should also touch, that made me think, Alex, because you have read it in different forms, we should also touch on that at some point. Definitely, I want to say something about that. Yeah, the castle. So this is an idea that I learned about from my friend Vegard Olsen, although I don't know if he learns about it from somewhere else. Definitely it might or may not be his metaphor, but unfortunately I can't trace its lineage further than that. Well, I could ask Vegard, but I haven't. And but the ideas in it, as I understand it, are Carl Jung or Jungian ideas, about shadow and about there being parts of us that we don't let ourselves access. Parts of ourselves that we disown. And if we think about this in the context of the book, we give it some of that context. So we've got this idea that we could be our calm, connected, skillful, noble, higher self more. That's the kind of grounding principle. Most people, I don't know if that journey is ever done. It's not done for me. And these ideas and practices are still useful. We can, the kind of grounding idea is we could be that more. It would be useful to be that more. And therefore we might want to think about how we do that. And there are kind of three core ideas in the book, which we can get to later. The third of them being that curiosity is the antidote to contraction. And that being that we have these feelings of contraction, which often is an uncomfortable feeling, like often a physical sensation. We could talk more about this if you two want to take us there. So we have these physical contractions, we feel them, they're unpleasant, and when we're in them, we tend to react rather than respond. We tend to be saying the things we regret, and all these kinds of things. And again, we could have this idea that there's these deeper parts of ourselves, essentially the unconscious parts of ourselves, that are actually running the show much more than we think. So we like to think it's the rational, sensible part of us, or even this kind of transrational, higher part of us. But really, a lot of the time, it's the bits underneath that are running the show. And sometimes this will be these unconscious parts of us that Jung would have called the shadow, probably, and that we, there's two ways of saying it. That either, let me slow it down. So, and what we might think about them is, if we aren't conscious about them, if we don't relate to them, then they run the show much more. And if we can kind of reclaim them slightly, then we have more power to choose. We have more opportunity to respond rather than react. And we're just a little bit less ruled by them. And the idea with this metaphor is we can think about this as if, and it feels true from all the curiosity is the antidote to contraction work that I've done over the years, which is much. This feels completely and continually annoyingly true. Because it'd be much better to just be able to ignore the bits of me that I don't like, to and to never have to do any kind of slowed down, conscious, deep work. But it just seems to always be useful to do that. And so in the metaphor, the idea is exactly as you said. What if we think of ourself, the whole of ourself, as some kind of big castle? And I like that because I love castles and those stories that involve castles and all that kind of thing. But also because I sometimes think this imagery from kind of myth touches things. It's like seeped into culture. So it's a very useful metaphor because we can all kind of imagine it. And what if each part of the castle represents different qualities or parts of us? And then the story might be like this. When we're younger, any age, but this stuff seems to mostly happen in childhood and adolescence, or a big stage of it happens then. And so we're kind of first socialized. So as we first learn what do good people do, what do bad people do, what is good behavior, what is bad behavior, we learn, what we're allowed to do, what it's okay for a good person to do. And there are some things that are fine, and there are some things that are definitively not fine. And this will happen in all kinds of ways, for very good-natured reasons most of the time, and sometimes for malicious reasons, or through real neglect, we might say. We'll learn that equality is bad. For example, I don't know about you two, as a British man growing up, I learned that anger is bad pretty clearly. Like, it's really, I don't have really any evidence in my life of a man channeling anger well in a good way. And it's like really anywhere. I mean, if we slowed down, maybe I could come up with that stuff, and maybe maybe it's one of the reasons sports are great. So I therefore, young me learns and I learn this in interesting ways, right? Like I learn it by being told that, but I also learn it by how I feel. So I get really angry with some other kid at school. This is a true story, like a friend of mine, and punch him, and I feel horrible. For days, weeks, I still remember the feeling now, whatever we're on, like 30 years later. Like, that's a pretty strong signal. Shut that away, right? It's dangerous. So, but I'm 10 at that time, right? So I'm not a sophisticated, hopefully, adult looking at the situation. I'm a 10-year-old, and I'm doing the best I can as a 10-year-old, which is I get in trouble, and I hurt someone I care about if I let anger get out of control. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to find the bit of the castle that is anger. Let's call it a particular tower. This is a tower of anger. And I'm going to lock off that tower so that I never go in there, so that I don't cause harm to the people I care about, and I don't get into trouble. And depending on who you are, one or both of those sides might be stronger, for the internal feeling or the external feeling. That's fine. Great. Good stuff. Robbie doesn't punch his friend anymore. I don't get into trouble as much. And I don't have to feel that horrible feeling of guilt or shame. And it's fine until there comes a point in the future where that isn't fit for the complexity of the world that I have to deal with, or where I find myself running up against problems, things that I'm not able to do that I want to be able to do. And have this sense then, or through that metaphor and this kind of inquiry, we can get this sense, okay, so what if I've been a bit clumsy because I was 10 in how I shut off the tower to anger? And I haven't actually, the dangerous bit of anger is just the top level of this tower, some turret room right at the top. And I've shut off the whole tower. And in that tower are all the things that are related to anger, but not anger. So we can imagine a kind of, like the Wheel of Life exercise, right? Where you've got like all these qualities around the outside. And 10 out of 10 is dangerous anger. And 10 out of 10 is also, the kind of toxic, avoidant positivity, but it's also sexual energy out of control. It's also greed or envy out of control, right? And all these, you can imagine that those kind of different qualities that could be around the outside. 10 out of 10 is mostly destructive in a socialized world, in a society that requires us to cooperate. If everybody had 10 out of 10 greed, like everyone would just be stealing everything from the shops, and we'd be in all kinds of trouble, and people would be nicking stuff from old ladies all the time. The world would fall to bits. So we probably do want everyone to avoid 10 out of 10 on those things. But down the line from anger are some interesting things that are very useful to me, which includes healthy confrontation, the ability to stand up for myself, the ability to be direct about what I care about, the ability probably to put a book out in the world. Like, you have to have a bit of disagreeable, like, willingness to say, F you to people if you're going to put a book out in the world. And if I'm not allowed any of that energy, then that could be a limiting factor on what's possible in my life. And therefore, we want to give people this sense that it's possible to work healthily with these kinds of qualities. I wouldn't do this work with everybody, but for people who are in a good state of health, you can do this work as a coach. You can take that castle metaphor, you can share it with somebody, and you can start asking these questions. Like, okay, so yeah, it sounds like it's really not okay for you to be an angry person, but what? And then you can ask them the just thing that gets the shade of grey. Like, what would be the 5%? And you guys might have seen me do this on the Coach's Journey community over the years. What would be the 5% healthy version of anger that, like, actually would be totally okay for a good person to have, or that you could totally use here? And then we get this sense of like, oh yeah, like having a robust debate is a normal thing that people do. Like, why do I feel terrified of that? That was where that piece of this is a real piece of work, by the way, that I'm talking about, this anger. Like, this is where part of where it came up for me. I remember doing this work with Vegard on a bench in Embankment Gardens, and like, you get the sense of like, oh right, yeah, well, it's probably connected in some way. And it is worth saying, the storytelling about why I shut off anger that I've just done then about this sort of fight when I was 10, I don't know that that's the whole story. As I do this work more and more, I have this kind of idea of what the story is, and then I do a bit more work and I find out it started earlier, and I do a bit more work and I find out it started earlier. So often these kinds of things, but having the story of really what matters is the thing now conscious so that I can see it and then be like, okay, maybe I'm afraid of confrontation here, not because of the confrontation, but because of something else happened a long time ago. We had this idea in the book about the Fred Kaufman idea about it's not about the chicken, it's about the last 20 years. And so, which is worth saying just really briefly now, because I brought it in. Kaufman's in this restaurant. There's this elderly couple on the other side having this kind of like tense argument. Everything goes quiet, just as the woman says to the man, "It's not about the chicken, Harry. It's about the last 20 years. And I think that idea is incredibly useful when we're doing this kind of work, because it just tells us how often the argument we're having with our partner, the way we're reacting to a situation, is not about what it looks like it's about. It's actually about something from a long time ago. And if we use something like the castle metaphor, we use the curiosity as the antidote to contraction idea, then we start to get this perspective on it, and we just react a little less and get a little bit more choice. There was a long answer to your question, Alex. Did you get it? Like, what lands for you about the castle now that didn't before, or what?
Just think, I didn't like. Once you said about the shadow work, I completely got that as the analogy. I don't think I'd realised that, and I've heard a little bit of the work of Jung, but not that much. I just think it's so interesting because it feels like, to me, what feels true is that there's a sort of a righteous anger. There's the anger of getting things done. There's a anger at injustice, for example. So there's a massive difference between someone being angry irrationally and hurting other people, and being angry at injustice and wanting to change things. And so, for example, when you said about putting this book out there into the world, part of that, I imagine, is that you could, if you were to write the opposite book of what you've written, okay, imagine what that would be like, what themes that would have. And essentially, I think that what's so useful about the book for me is that some of the stories that we tell ourselves can be challenged, and this book provides a challenge to them. And actually, the sort of prevailing ideologies out there in the world are not the ideologies of this book. There's even if just the idea of choice in general and having, being able to determine our own lives isn't necessarily always going to be the prevailing ideology. So what I like about this concept is that in order for us to move forward as whole human beings, be the people we want to be, live the lives that we want to, I think we just have to be able to critically say, what are the stories behind these things, and what do we really want to carry forward, compared to what are the stories in our past, what are the stories that we still believe, and what are the stories we want to think more deeply about.
Oh, wow, yeah. I'll have to think about that thing about the worldview, prevailing worldview not being the same as the book. That's a thought I haven't really had, although I guess now I'm saying, of course, it's true. But yeah, I think like that, I love those reflections, and I think what you're pointing at there, crucial in the book, throughout the book, and each chapter has this kind of summary, and that's a free ebook that people who download the book can get to kind of really make it real, because I'm always really bothered about this work, like actually not just being a nice read, right, but actually changing things. But those chapter summaries, the things that can make this active and not passive, a lot of them are questions, and a lot of them are questions along the lines that you just said, Alex. Like, what is really happening here? Like, if we're in a difficult conversation with somebody, like, what is the actual truth, and what is just all these stories that I'm bringing in here, either from the past, my past, the recent past, just the moment, and what if I could choose things to be different? And I guess that's the kind of we haven't kind of named it explicitly, but that's the foundational idea of the book, right? Which is, and probably like the people who will get the most out of this book is if you've had a whisper of this idea already, that idea I'm about to describe, but you haven't explored it fully, like in a way, that's the kind of perfect time to get the most from this book. And the idea being, basically in every moment, there's a choice we can have. But we don't have to respond the way we've always responded or the way we are naturally inclined to respond. We have this choice. It's the key idea of chapter 1 of the book. I can choose, you can choose, right? And once we have this sense that we don't have to just have our thoughts happening to us. They're a thing we can examine and look at. For some people, it's hard to remember that there was a time in all of our development where we didn't know that. Where we didn't know that our beliefs mattered, where we didn't know that our assumptions mattered, especially for coaches. But if you're a coach, like that's an incredible thing to try and remember, because every time you ask someone a question, in a coaching session, you're inviting them to just twist the way they're looking at the world, see a new perspective, and therefore have a greater opportunity to choose. So I think it is pointing to the kind of what some of the fundamental ideas of the book, but also of the work we all do.
There's a reflection here that might become it will hopefully become a question, but like my real sense there, Robbie, as well, is that like it feels like if some of the ideas you bring into this are like going on holiday and experiencing a new place, what this book is doing a world tour and taking them, bringing them together, and then putting them through the lens of, and this is how they can look lived. And the example that jumps out in my mind is the one where you applied these principles in like a disagreement on a train carriage with a train conductor. And like, and I think there's two really beautiful bits about this. Is one, I think the things you reference are things, some of them I've read or seen before, and they're great concepts, but seeing not only how they apply, but when you bring them together, it almost creates this like a lens that you can see them through as like it's then a toolkit of concepts rather than one or two that, it feels like it equips you with the power to choose. And also then what that could look like on a minute by minute, moment by moment basis, not just the profound shifts that will also happen as a result of those moments where we choose to go, what's actually happening, choosing to take contraction, curiosity is antidote to contraction. And I'm happy for you to like expand perhaps on that train story, but you mentioned a couple of like the key ideas in the book. I wondered if you said there were 3. I wondered if it might be useful so just to bring those in so that we can kind of play around with them a bit more as well.
Yeah, sure. And I can tell the train story if we want, for sure. But yeah, let's bring those ideas in. So I think we mentioned 2 of the 3. So we'll just do it pretty quickly, and then we can double click on them as much as we want. So yeah, the core idea, and I used to read, like Alex mentioned, I used to read these choose your own adventure books when I was young. And at some point in this exploration of this worldview for this book, in the early days, I had this sense that, and it probably, if copyright was different, no, I changed the name before I thought about the copyright. It might have been called Choose Your Own Adventure Inside and Out, right? Because we get this sense of in these Choose Your Own Adventure books, you'd come to the end of a chapter and it'd say, you've walked down the corridor, there's some stairs going up and a door going down to go up the stairs, go to page 60 to go down through the door, go to page 26. And I just got the sense that there's far more opportunities to be choosing our experience of life than we think. So again, in every moment, this is what I believe, there's a choice. There's a choice so often in the outside world, like how do we do this? And we see this in our coaching work, right? That when you sit down with somebody, they think there's only one way to approach a challenge. And then by the time you've done 40 minutes of work together, there's this whole other avenue that they're exploring to approach challenge from a different way. So there's choice like that, which can be limited by our thinking. And then there's also choice in how we respond to what happens in the world. And that's mostly what the book is about. So that first core idea is you can choose, like in any moment, and explore that in various ways through various influences. And we touched on some already. We can get to more. And then that the kind of two crucial things to choose if you want to not just find calm, but also connection. So that's idea number 2. And then if you want to continually grow your capacity to deal with the complexity of the world, that's idea number 3. That if you choose to kind of live by them, you will have those things. So if you want more connection and more skill with other people, a very powerful idea to choose is, what if everyone is doing their best? So rather than living through this idea and assumption that I realized that I was subconsciously living through loads of the time, that people are kind of idiots out to get me in all kinds of ways, the way they push me over on the London Underground, cut in front of us in queues, but also like the way my boss does or does not reply to my emails, and much more. And the train conductor we talked about, I had a crazy, maybe I can tell a really kind of redacted version of a truly crazy story with my neighbor. I have to do it now. I've mentioned it, don't I? I had a neighbor years ago, and I had this massive run-in with her. And it was my fault, really. I knocked on the wrong door about a really loud party that was happening quite late at night. And she was rightfully annoyed about that. But she was like, the response I got was extreme. And I was writing this book. So here we go, actually. Here's a good... So it's not... I was writing this book, and I was working on this chapter, basically. And I was like, well, what do I believe I should do now? I could hide downstairs and hope to never bump into her again, or I could try and live by the book. And if I assume she's doing her best, what do I do? And then it got me out of my kind of righteous anger about the situation. And I was like, well, I need to say sorry because I knocked on her door really late at night and it wasn't her door. And it doesn't really matter how over the top she was in response. I shouldn't have knocked on her door, and I regret that. So I got her some chocolates. I knocked the next day. She actually sent me away, said, come back in 5 minutes. She was on the phone. And I was like, man, I really didn't want that to happen. I just wanted no answer, or at least to get it over with. I had to stew on it. But I went back up, and I can't tell you the story because it's too personal. But what I will say is she explained to me that what was happening with her daughter, which I would argue is like literally one of the, I mean, you couldn't make it up. It couldn't have been a more unlikely, extreme situation for her to be in her life that made it more understandable exactly why she reacted why she did when I knocked on her door at 1 a.m, right? It was an incredible demonstration of this. But what it meant was I didn't have to live in fear of bumping into this woman on the stairs for the rest of the time I lived there. And actually, when I saw her again, we had some connection then. And if you take that attitude, choose to believe that everyone is doing their best, then most of the things that happen with interactions with other people will turn out better. Obviously not all the time. Obviously there are bad actors in the world. Obviously there are people with personality disorders who don't behave like normal people who you can't really account for when you're writing a book like this. But almost all of the time, that is an idea that's very powerful to choose. And then the last one, which we've already touched on, is this idea that when we're feeling these contractions, if we don't want to feel them, or if we want to act more as our higher self, or as we want to keep deepening our ability to access more parts of us in the way that we did so we can be more skillful, choosing curiosity when we're feeling contraction. So when we're feeling upset, when we're feeling triggered, all these things, if we choose curiosity there, then we will grow our capacity to respond well to the world. There's the headline with a little neighbor story that I've never told before thrown in.
Yeah, bonus story instead of you can get the book to see the train one. You have to listen to the
That's
podcast
true, yeah.
to hear the. I want to jump in there because you mentioned we're all doing our best like frame, which I remember you referencing kind of a lot of that idea came from Brené Brown and her work Rising Strong, which felt fitting reading the book because I'd recently read that book as well. And so I'm curious because for me it went, yeah, hello friend. This is something that's useful for me to remind myself of and I keep adopting. What were, if any, the ideas that felt like they kind of kept in this because of this 9-year process? Every now and then you're like, oh yeah, hello again. This needs some more inventing. Like which one felt like that one? And in the way that when we sometimes give like advice to someone, we go, I should definitely be taking that a bit more. Which I'm just curious if there was any one that there was a process, because I think part of this book is highlighting that it's not that you learn these concepts and then you've got them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, look, this is an annoying answer, but basically all of them. I mean, you can, and there are even those ideas that even some of those bits make it into the book, right? Let's like this bit about curiosity is the antidote to contraction, where I'm in the mid, I'm working on a draft of the book. I'm in the prep for getting married. I'm speaking to my therapist about what's going on. And he's like, well, next time that happens in the middle of like when you're feeling really, really like off, maybe you should just slow down and try and get curious. I'm like, man, I should have really known that, shouldn't I? It's like the idea coming back again, that I should be doing that. That example with a neighbor is a great example of this. And also, like I said, one of the things that kept happening was I would read other great books, like books that I knew were great books as I read them, like Jennifer's Mind Traps book, which people will have heard me talk about before. Um, like I said, we had Jennifer on the show. We can link to that in the show notes when I was talking to her about Mind Traps and the book that came after, and it had some of these ideas in it, in told obviously with her flavor. But yeah, they've kept coming back for me, and working on this draft is, fantastic because it just reminds me that I need to think about them again. And, the stories in the relationships chapter, they are from a different era of life. And Emma and I have to deal with a different level of complexity now. We've got children, we live in a different place, our work situation is different, like the level of complexity that we're dealing with and challenge is higher. And yet what I know is the relationship is still underpinned mostly by the things that are in that chapter, and coming back to that chapter, and which is built on the idea of doing, everyone is just doing their best, but what particular things do we need to choose when we get into thinking about our relationships? I mean, I'm just going to say, very useful for me to come back to that, right, and be reminded that it is very easy over time in any relationship, an intimate relationship, a friend, family member, work colleague, to slip from the practice of assuming good intentions, and to find yourself assuming bad intentions far more than far more than I like to think that I would. So they've all been like that, to some greater or lesser degree, and I think that's because for me they are really fundamental ideas. Hi everybody, just a quick thing before we get back to the show. If you like what you're hearing on this episode, the chances are you'll love An Introduction to the Coaching Business Flywheel, a free ebook available at thecoachesjourney.com. It's the most important piece of content I've ever created for coaches, boiling down everything I've learned from this show, from working with master coaches and from my own experience into one simple model. The model not only tells you the only things you have to do to have a sustainable coaching business, but also shows you how they can form a virtuous circle that keeps your coaching business growing. It's all free, and you can find it at thecoachesjourney.com. There's a link in the show notes. Now, back to the show.
I'm pleased that we've sort of double-clicked a bit on this, what if everyone's doing their best idea and the train conductor, because it was one of the bits in the book that I most struggled with. And I think this is one of the nice things about the book for me, is that like I felt challenged at times, which I found really, really interesting. I found interesting because it's a very interesting experience where I generally, know Robbie's work reasonably well. Like I've seen it develop over the years. And, in general, Robbie will introduce concepts, and like maybe, sometimes there'll be something I understand the first time, sometimes I need to think about it, but I'll be like, yeah, I agree with that. And then with that one, everyone doing their best, I remember sort of feeling a certain amount of challenge around it. Challenge for me to enact that in the world, and challenge to whether I believe that to be true. And I know, Robbie, that you're not saying it's always true, etc., etc. But without going too meta here, I think one of the things I've realized about the book is that there are certain concepts where I think that actually, whether I believe something to be true or not may not be related to its efficacy. So what I mean is in the train conductor's story. So in the neighbor's story, we know it's a personal story, so we got the detail, but we know there was something behind it that means that person, their reaction was in some way justified, understandable, more than it would have been had you not got that. My point about the train conductor is, when I heard the train conductor's story, and I will summarize it very, very briefly, just because for the purposes of we'll keep talking about it, is essentially a situation in which Robbie and his wife were on a train. It was very crowded. There was a problem with the numbering system, the carriages, what have you, and they ended up sitting in first class, which would have been the carriage they should have sat in, but they didn't have first class tickets. And it's how do you, in that situation, deal with a train conductor who's not necessarily going to be the most sympathetic about that situation and doesn't understand all the things that have happened before. So my immediate thing was I thought there is a right and there is a wrong in this situation. And frankly, it's their job to have to deal with these difficult situations. And it's also their job to put things right if it keeps going wrong in this place of work. Whereas for me, just passing through their place of work, I feel I'm not going to put it all to rights about how they organize things again. But I was thinking to myself, even if that person wasn't doing their best in whatever capacity, I evaluate them. What actually happened was that when Robbie chose to engage with him on a level that assumed that, the situation worked out better than I believe it would had he not assumed that. And I find that a really interesting concept. So I don't know how you want to engage with that, Robbie, but like, even if we struggle with these ideas, concepts, do you think it's good for the reader to just give them a try and see how they work out for them? How would you take that?
Yeah, I love the way you interrogated that, and just as you started to bring it in, you said, "I know you're not saying it's always true, Robbie," and I actually wrote down, and then you basically said this yourself. I wrote down, I'm not saying it's ever true that anyone is doing their. I mean, I do philosophically believe, right, that everyone is doing their best because what's the alternative? Like that they're deliberately doing something worse than they could, but like you don't even have to believe that because of what you just said, Alex. So there's this nice book that a guy called Derek Sivers wrote called Useful Not True or something like that. It's just this idea that what we think to be true, or the number of things that can be said as being undeniably true is in like really small. The things that are like a machine and an alien and a cat would all agree are true if the cat could talk. That's one of the examples he gives. Is such a small thing. Like there is a computer on this desk. Like I am standing here, but like, are we talking to each other right now? Like even that is not like I don't think you could say is objectively true because you aren't here. And so you've got all these amazing things that aren't necessarily true, and then there are some things that are really useful. And the other, like, yeah, in that example with the train guard, there are lots of ways that could have played out. And I actually remember you challenging me. So, yeah, one of the things that Alex did was he was an early test reader of this book. And I remember you kind of challenging me on that as part of that. And there's some bits in the book that are still there that come from that challenge, which when I read them, I remember that that's where they came from. That there would have been other ways through that. But yeah, I don't think it would have resolved as peacefully and calmly. And I prize peace and calm. Now, not everybody does. And there's some shadow stuff to this for sure, right? That I shy away from confrontation and all that kind of thing. And somebody who loves confrontation, and I'm always kind of envious when you hear stories about people who had lots of like healthy arguments at the dinner table when they were children and that kind of thing, like big debate. Like, oh, that would have been a cool thing to have practiced every Wednesday night. But like that's not me. And so if you don't mind confrontation, yeah, by all means, just like lay into the train guard, you kind of beat him into submission, make him let you sit wherever you want. But like, it was really interesting, again, for the same reasons with the neighbor in that example, because Emma was there, it was interesting. So she and the train guard started having the exchange, as I remember it, and I was suddenly outside of it. And I was like, wait a sec. We could slow this down. We can do this differently. And I chose that point of view. The other example in the book about this is an idea that comes from one of my dad's books, about what if the person in front of you is cutting in and out of like traffic really dangerously and endangering everyone by overtaking on a narrow road. And he gives the hypothetical in a really nice way that stays with me, which is why it's in the book. But 99% of the time they are probably just like an idiot driving like a fool, like with disregard for everyone's safety. But are you sure? And what if they're on the way? They're trying to get to the hospital as fast as they can because, in my dad's example, their mum's dying. Or what if their wife's about to have a baby, and she's in the car with them and they're trying to get there. And at that point, you can argue the sensibleness still of cutting in and out of traffic. But as soon as you step out of it, the internal experience is different. So if we go back to Brene Brown, she gives this example, and I tell the story. I saw her speak in 2015, which is partly why this idea and that thing is so much part of the book. But she tells this story in Rising Strong as well. She finds out through her research into people who are more resilient, that's essentially what Rising Strong is about, the people who bounce back from setbacks, that they all tend to believe this thing that we're talking about, that the other person is just a human doing their best. And she thinks it's a load of rubbish. And then she finds out her husband, who's a pediatrician, believes this. And she asks him, do you really believe it's true? And she says in the book that he thinks for 10 minutes before he comes back with an answer, which is spectacular. I don't think I've ever thought for 10 minutes and then come back straight into the conversation about one thing. But he thinks for 10 minutes and then he says, the truth is I don't know, but I know that when I think like this, it gets me out of judgment and I see the world more as it is and less as I think it should be. And again, that just feels like those two things, the judgment and resentment that can build up if we assume the opposite, if we assume malice, where just as we have no grounds to believe anyone is acting out of good intentions, we have no grounds to know that they're acting out of bad intentions. So both are equally false and unfalsifiable most of the time as assumptions. And so we get to choose. Do we want to ground ourselves in this kind of judgment that Brene Brown's husband talks about? Or I often think of it as this kind of smoldering resentment that I would carry around for days or weeks. Or do we want to try and clean that out and at the same time, therefore, be able to see the world more as it is, therefore be able to respond more skillfully? And both of those things feel like worth prizing. And yeah, it's worth coming back to that idea that you brought in. It doesn't really matter about the truth. Really, it matters about the utility and depends what you want. And you get to choose again, right?
And to jump in on that, Robbie, I think it was you that shared the example of Harry Kane and his approach every time he misses a chance. But it feels like it's applicable here. So correct me if I'm wrong, my sense is every time he misses an opportunity, he then thinks, well, I've got more chance of scoring the next one. And I'm no mathematician, but my sense is that's just not true. But I can see how that can be really useful in that context for when the next opportunity comes up.
Yeah, it's in one of the 12-minute method books, that one, I think, the red one. And that's as I understand the story as well. Kane believes that, if he misses one, he's more likely to score the next one. And you can kind of feel the probability kind of assumption in there, which is if I, on average, score 7 out of 10 of my shots, or 2 out of 10, I don't know what it would be, even for Harry Kane, then if I've missed one, it's more likely the next one's one of the ones that I hit the target with or score with. My view personally is that is definitely wrong, because I was a mathematician up to undergrad level, and I remember from year 9 or whatever that if you flip year 9 probability, if you flip a coin 100 times, you get 100 tails. Is the probability of the next one is still 50-50. But if it helps, what we don't want, and you can see this in Harry Kane if you watch him play, he looks cold as ice. Right. And a bit I know you're a rugby fan, Johnny Wilkinson always looked like this to me. It looked like, he wasn't thinking about anything. And these players that are able to do that, they're somehow quietening everything. And in a way, for those 90 or 80 or whatever minutes that they're playing, it doesn't really matter if what they believe is true, because what we don't want, if we're an England fan, is for Harry Kane to get in his head and to be stepping up to take a penalty, for example, in a shootout, and have the look in his eyes that Frank Lampard had in 2004, and when I knew he was going to miss, right? And you look in Harry Kane's eyes, and every time he believes, right? He never looks like he's going to miss. And my guess would be part of that is because he is choosing to believe. Now, he may not know that the maths is off. We'd have to email him and ask him. but he's choosing to believe, I think, that it makes him more likely to score next time. And that definitely aids his performance, would be obviously, my huge assumption. My huge assumption is that kind of thing would really aid performance. And we could do that as coaches, right? You definitely don't know if you've had a bad experience with a client where you've got completely lost, or they've been super hard work and you're questioning your ability. You don't want to carry that into the next call. So you might want to choose to believe something different. And we could work out what that belief is. You could just choose to believe every time there's a bad call, it's like Harry Kane, right? It's more likely that the next call is good.
I wanted to ask you something on a slightly different subject, Robbie, which is about, you've now put a number of books out into the world. So this is your 5th book, is that right? 5th book. So I was wondering about the sort of the energy that you felt around these things. Firstly, because putting out your first book, which obviously wasn't your first piece of writing, but putting out your first book compared to now, and also, and this is just a very personal reflection, is one of the reasons when I first engaged with this, with the early writings of this, I so wanted to you to get this out there, is because I just thought it was putting a sort of really special part of Robbie out into the world for me. So I thought that, like, when I read it, I just thought I shouldn't be the only person reading this. Basically, it would be a shame if I was the only person reading this. And so I'm really, really pleased it's out there where other people are going to engage with it. And also because I suppose for you, as people engage with it and give you feedback, like we're doing now, and sort of around it, it helps to refine your understanding too for your next bits of work. So putting that out there. And so I was just wondering, like, you've described from a vulnerability perspective about this book, but in terms of, if you're thinking of the sweep of your career, the things you want to do and the things that matter to you, like, where does this book feel in that sort of sequence for you? Have you thought about it at that level?
Yeah, it's a great question. I got to say, it's feeling more real this week. I've had the cover, the internal layout is finished, apart from one of you spotted a typo, so which I hadn't caught yet, and so that's got to be changed. But apart from that, it's basically done. But talking to you about it is definitely bringing it a new energy, like is reminding me of these ideas and these stories and allowing me to embody them in a different way. Like telling them aloud is really different to writing them down, especially when actually I wrote most of them down, at least 5 years ago. I don't think there's anything we've touched on yet that wasn't written 5 years ago in some form. Obviously, it's mostly written in different forms now and edited more and all that kind of thing. So there's that side of the energy, and I don't know about the sweep of my career or life. I think it's really, for me, it's really hard to get a sense of that. It doesn't have the feel of Start When You're Stuck, which is the yellow 12-minute book, which felt, did feel kind of like there's something different. Like there's a kind of threshold crossed with some Campbell language. And I think there's a weird thing. So I got this publishing offer on the 12-minute books and this one 5 years ago, and in the end turned it down. And then so when running the publishing of a book like this yourself, it's a kind of weird experience because you don't get to hand it over at any point. Now, I don't know if an author working with Random House ever really feels like that as well, but I bet they do for a while. And there is a bit where it was with, the cover designer was working and the interior designer was working or the editor was working where it's handed away. But I think part of the reason I don't know yet is because I won't know until after it's out, right? I won't know until it's done. Then it'll be done. Now it isn't done yet, right? We're recording this, but it might still not come out. And we don't it will, but we don't really know that yet. Also, I struggle. I'm not very good at, I don't relate to some of these things in the way that I think I expect to, or other people do or expect to. And so whilst I look back now with fondness about these pictures of me holding up 12-minute method book one, at the time I didn't feel I saw this video about the other day of Minor Arias, who was on episode 3 of the show, unboxing his new book. Now maybe it's because I know Minor and I know his wife Jenny, who I could hear laughing behind the camera, but there was this laugh that he had when he opened the book. And I don't remember, I'm just whoa, look at this. And I don't remember having that about the 12-minute method books. And I think that's an area of personal growth for me, right? There's there's a castle thing going on there with something shut off. And I'd love to feel more of that because I think it's kind of joy is what you could hear in Jenny's laugh behind the camera and then Miner's laugh on the screen. But I just think with these pieces of work, right? When you're putting something out, you have to believe that it's worth putting out. And you have to put everything into making it as good as you can to put it out. But most things aren't someone's career highlight. Most albums put out by a band aren't their best album. And most books written by an author aren't their best book. And so I don't think we know that yet. I don't know what it will mean to people. I don't know what it will mean to me. I don't know what it'll feel like a few years on. Um, and I am slightly odd because it's like sometimes, like I had, it's been interesting. I've been using AI quite a bit on as a sub for a kind of book coach who knows about how to run book launches, which has been quite cool. But at some point it had this thing like, I don't know, it gave me some talking point that I was thinking that I could use, and it was like, I've always thought about writing this book. Like, I couldn't wait to get this book published because of X. And that's not where this came from for me, right? You've heard where it came from. It came from Joel asking me a great question and me listening to some deeper part of me that wasn't being given airtime. And it came from unwillingness to give in to resistance, essentially. And that's a really different, like, I don't judge that particularly, but that's a really different place to somebody who's like, written their PhD research and now they want to change it into a book and they feel like it's going to be their life's work. Yeah. And flip side of it is, who knows? So if I had to guess what place this would have in the sweeping, the longer sweeping arc of life, I had this kind of, been doing some deep work for myself this year, and I had this kind of, I found this, what would we call it, like, story that I am like, I found this story about writing, which was, let me see if I can do it justice because I haven't really talked about this, I don't think. Basically, that, like, I found this. It's a long story. It started from, I did this running thing, and it was interesting. So this endurance running thing with my friends, and I the whole way through was like, they were like, involved a number of laps. They were like, I'm going to try and do 8 or 6 or whatever. And the whole way through, I was like, I think I can probably manage 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. Right? That was what I believed I was capable of. And in the end, I ran faster than any of my friends over the whole period. So I ran 8 laps, just like everybody did, but I actually ran the fastest 8 laps. Not all of them the fastest, but the fastest average time. And I got really interested in this idea of like, okay, like that is my expectation of what I am capable of is hugely out of whack with reality. Like, what is going on there? And as I delved into that, I found like another one about writing. I was just like, hang on a sec. Like, I don't really think of myself as a writer. And yet, like, what's going on there? Like, I write more than almost anyone I know. And who knows? And then I had, I don't know how I think about that now. Like, I was like, oh, okay, am I a coach who does writing, which has been my story for a long time? Or I'm a writer who happens to have a day job as a coach? And like, obviously you don't have to be those things, but like, either way, it's interesting. And so it could be, because it's a good question, Alex, it could be that I'll look back on this as being like the thing that owns that part of me. Like, by doing this thing, or that was the first one that came out after that, that insight. But then, having said that, throughout this process, it's been pretty painful, and I've been less sure that I want to do more books. So we'll see what happens.
It's interesting in that context as you talk about it, Robbie, in the like, I remember, I think in the Philip Crocker interview, or he might have said it to me separately, that when he rebranded his business from, I think it was called Darwin Whitty, to Philip Crocker, his like son-in-law said, "Oh, so the thing to do is you should probably write a book." And he created a podcast and said, but I think a book might come, but that's an aside. But I'm curious then, and this is maybe framed in the context of many listeners will be coaches creating or running businesses, and an aspect of their work will be how they share their work and how they create it. And it sounds like, well, it's a bit like the 12-minute method books. You said you wrote them for you, and I think there is an element, isn't there, of everything we create isn't as much for us as for others. And so I'm like, if at all you saw this thing you were making as part of your business or body of work in that kind of context, and how that might have changed as well from 2016 to today.
Yeah, good questions. Let me try and answer them, but if I don't answer some of that, like, catch me up on it. It didn't come from, as you heard, it didn't come from what's a smart thing to do to run a coaching business. I think If you can write a book without any emotional cost, then that could be a smart thing to do. If it's just fun. I think it's a risky business to do something like that requires as much time, thought, intellectual, emotional energy as writing a book with only business outcomes in mind. Because there's a reasonably likely chance that the world is complex, business is complex. That's partly what the book is about, right? But there's a reasonably likely chance that it directly leads to nothing. And if you only do the thing for the outward metrics, that's a risky game. And so like, I'm glad that Philip didn't write a book just because his son-in-law, whoever, said you should write a book. A good reason to write a book is some part of you wants to write a book. And that can be a kind of messy, with lots of resistance, as kind of I've been talking a little bit about today. And, in probably how to share what you've made, there's a bit, it might be in how to start when you're stuck. There's a bit about, like, if you make something, it is definitely going to change. If you make something from the heart, right? There is one person it's definitely going to change. And that's the person who makes it, right? Because of we come back to the full circle, right? Because of the vulnerability required, the courage required, the transformation required to make a thing that matters. And so that's worth doing for basically anyone ever. That's what I solidified as I believe that. That's what I solidified as I created those 12-minute method books. So that is definitely true of this. It's for me because I had to change who I am in order to release it. And it's for me because all those ideas are really important ones for me to remember in my marriage and elsewhere. And look, on the flip side of it, having written a book is good for business. Like, it does. People like that kudos that people give you as an author of a book is still there. It's very effective. It's a very useful tool to leverage for public appearances, podcasts, speaking events, all those kinds of things. It's doing work while I'm not there. And if you do it in the way that I do it, and this is one of the reasons that I do it the way I do it. So part of it is that zone of genius thing. But the way I talk myself back round is what I want with all my work is for people to know me better at the end of it than they did at the start. And that's good for business, right? Because then when people rock up to a prospective coaching call or onto my website, they're not, it's like you said, Alex, Swallow, I think you said something about like it feels like bits of me in there, right? Or knowing people who read it will know me in a different way. Well, that's good for business as well. And it's a filter because some people will read it and think, this is hippie nonsense. Or like, why would I possibly want to live with that idea that everyone's doing their best when I know that guy at work is literally manipulating everyone around him? And they fine, perfect, probably not for me, And the people who love it, they'll probably get more out of spending more time with me in some ways, or listening to the show, or whatever it might be. Did that answer that question?
I think so. Or if not, I'm going to riff off it in the way that you said people will relate to the book and the ideas in different ways to the ones you do. But what really resonated is it felt like, a theme of the 112 episodes of this podcast is that there are like millions of ways to run a sustainable, like powerful coaching business, and like writing a book might be one of them, but that shouldn't be the reason to write a book.
Yeah, and if I think about the 12-minute books, so, I would guess they're still way down in terms of, like, they've cost me money. And we're 5 years in now, and we've had, like thousands and thousands of orders, but some of them are in promotions and that kind of thing, so it's not all full-price sales. But I'm still down on the surface. And yet, what is possible because people know or like or trust me more because of those books? Like, there were definitely early days. There were a couple of one-to-one clients who would have paid me like, I don't know, $5,000, probably $4,000 or $5,000 each at that time, if I remember right. Who they weren't there because of the books, but the books definitely helped. And so, these things they can make a real difference, but it's a kind of nebulous difference. And you can go back to the coaching business flywheel, right? write a book is not one of the steps on that flywheel. But what does it help with? Well, it helps with connecting with people. It's definitely an opportunity for people to experience me more. Hopefully, it helps people create insight. And so it does feed in. Maybe there comes out of it ways to offer people to experience me more. I have little, what they call lead magnets in there so that people, some of the readers, the kind of most engaged readers, will probably end up on a mailing list of mine until they unsubscribe if they want to. And so there are ways to use these things, but yeah, it is absolutely a choice. And I think because of the amount, well, for me anyway, the amount of time, energy that is involved, you got to really want to do the book. I think you should really want to do the book. If you don't really want to do the book, you just want to have a more successful business, there's probably a quicker way to get the more successful business than writing a book. That's my general reflection.
Yeah, I think for me, the reason why I'm particularly excited about this book is because, you put a lot of content out there. But if I was to point to somebody who didn't know you and say, here is a piece of content that I think shows why Robbie is a person I think you should listen to. Robbie's an interesting person who'll get you to think in interesting ways. I certainly can't think of anything better for me to be able to say that. And in a way that I think with your other books, actually, your other books could be applied to such a broad array of situations. I mean, literally, the idea of starting when you're stuck can be applied to everything. It doesn't have to be a creative project. It could be about so many different things. But I think this feels to me like more of an easier way for me to say, oh, this is still one aspect of Robbie. It's not Robbie encapsulated, but it is a bit more, maybe in the way of if you wrote a very long article, but it's an easier way for me to show why your work's special and why I like it and engage with it and find it interesting. And so that's one of the reasons when I was an early reader, I was like, oh, this is magic, but it's a very particular type of magic that I think your other work has a flavor of, but it's like a consolidation of magic. That's what I call it. It sort of brings those things together.
We'll put that on the cover of the second edition. A consolidation of magic. Alex Swale, author of How to Be an Influencer. Yeah, that's a nice reflection and very interesting because again, although plenty of people have read it over the years and given feedback in lots of different ways, and there's a lot, it had to be 9 years of it. I'm really paranoid. I've forgotten a bunch of people. I remembered like 3 people right at the last minute and had to ask Megan, who's doing the internal layout, to add them in. Like a lot of people have read and given feedback on this book, but that is interesting to hear. And I think there is a truth in that. So again, it's not why I did this. And if this book hadn't been here, and I had decided to work on another book, it would have probably been a Leading with Honor book or a Meaningful Productivity book. And in a way, they might do that and do it more. But there's something, now you're saying it, there's something kind of, what do you say, pure about this one, isn't there? For me, that is what you said. And that is kind of foundational. And I think for me, it's also important because we haven't really talked about it. But as I think of I mentioned Jennifer Garvey Berger, and as I think of the ideas that I think, well, so maybe here's an answer to that question from earlier about the longer sweep of business, right? As I think of the ideas that I know about that are likely to inform and underpin the next part of my work, those ideas from developmental psychology that Garvey Berger and others work on, they are going to be a part of that, I think. And this book, what I discovered about this book, this is like, we're a long way into this show, so if people are still here, they might be the kind of geeks who are interested in this. So I think this book tells the story of me transitioning from what Robert Keegan would call the socialized mind to what he would call the self-authored mind. And these are 2 stages of adult psychological development. Garvey Berger and I get into that a bit more in that interview a little bit, although not too much, because it gets a bit much when you do that too much. Alex Whitten and I did some work on this in person, didn't we, with some others earlier in the year. So it tells the story of that transition, which is the most common developmental transition that adults go through, according to those researchers. So it does give us something about that, and it is grounding us in this thing which I have been talking about and interested in for a few years, partly informed by the work on this book and seeing what it was about, partly that what I'm doing in my one-to-one work is about how do people relate to complexity, to the complexity of their work. in different ways. And one of the things you do to help people relate to complexity more is you help them develop their worldview in the way that Keegan or Garvey Berger would talk about. And that's kind of what the book is about. So in a way, I guess what I'm hearing is, for myself say, is there's two things. One is it does kind of plant me in that space. So I don't know that I put it in originally. So I was just thinking about the brainstorming of the subtitle and things like that, and which has been through me and the editor and AI and all kinds of things. I put the word complexity in first when I first started to see that connection. But it's good. It's probably good for my business to have that, to be grounding this book in that way. Maybe that has a business effect, but also maybe it starts to tip the business into the new phase in that way. Interesting.
Just jumping in on you mentioning complexity, Robbie, and I think at the beginning I talked about, so the question is around like language, and I noticed as well like the use of words that might not be as common today, and the words I'm thinking of are honor and like noble in terms of noble purpose, but there's real opportunity in using those words to reclaim them in a way that is complexity fit. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on them and how conscious that was. But also, just at the beginning, I remember saying that for me, this is a great book for me as a human in the world, but also as a coach. And just to sign like the honor question is a great coaching question. And, all these tools are things that our clients will experience and will experience. So the more aware we are, obviously, the more we're able to steward. But that's just a tangent. Your thoughts on that language of honor and nobility?
Yeah, and let's catch the tangent, because I think it's a really important thing to say. Yeah, like almost everything in this book is like a great coaching intervention, because it's kind of like, you got to remember, it was written starting almost, a year into my coaching. So I was really in this idea, this sense that we can question what we think. We can question our thoughts. We can question our beliefs, and these unconscious things run lots of parts of our lives. So there's so many exercises, and there's so many of them. Like I've told that it's not about the chicken story, I don't know, dozens of times to clients, probably not hundreds. And because it opens something up for people. And the same thing with this idea of assuming good intentions, of what if the other person is doing their best? Like the stories in the book about using that angle or another, about a client who was just assigning bad intentions to his business partner all the time. And as soon as he noticed that through the work we did, he was able to assign better intentions, and it started to happen. It started to look more and more likely. And this is one of the weird things that happens if we change a story we have. Then suddenly we have we find all the evidence for why this guy is a terrible business partner who is acting from like selfishly and manipulatively. And then when we start assuming maybe he's doing his best, or what if I read this email from the point of view as if he's a grade A business partner instead of a grade C/F, then actually I start to see the evidence that he in fact might be acting from that point of view. So I think that's really important. All of the stuff in the book could be great stuff, fuel for coaching. There's loads of questions in there, including the honor question. We could put a link to a blog that I wrote about that in the show notes. Those words, nobility, honor, the idea of the higher self, right? It's like language it's not really the language of a business book in some ways, is it? And some of it started, I think, when I don't know if we talked about it on that show or if it was just a thought I had as I listened to it. So when Neil, now a host of this show, interviewed me on his other podcast, I had this insight. I think it was, I'm gonna have to listen back. I think it's a long time ago now, 4 or 5 years. When I was listening to it, I had to pause it and have a thought. I remember exactly where I was, actually, so therefore it can't have been while Neil was interviewing me, because he didn't interview me next to St. Mary's Church in Battersea. He interviewed me on Zoom. But when I was listening back, I had this thought that I had, you've been on lots of Coaches Journey community calls between you, and I had this thing at the start, whenever people join you, that I bring in these values: courage, honesty, vulnerability, and leadership. And they are almost my values, except when I did an amazingly powerful kind of 5-minute purpose exercise years ago at a workshop I was at. Courage, honor, vulnerability, truth were the 4 values that came out. And so I suddenly, like, when I was listening back to this conversation Neil and I had, and we were talking about David Gemmell, who's the author I mentioned before, who died, like, who's a fantasy author, I was like, why am I hiding this word? Even in my group coaching program, like, why am I not mentioning it? And I got this sense of, like, maybe I'm hiding some part of myself. And then I thought about the ideas that are in chapter 4 of this book, which is the only one we haven't talked about, which is called No One Can Compete with You at Being You. On which the principles, for example, of everything we just talked about getting a version of me out in the world through the book, right? That's a great principle there. And so the idea really is that, in that chapter, is that one of the places that we might want to choose a different kind of story is around the competition and comparison we feel out in the world. I had one the other day, actually. I lost like 45 minutes of a perfectly happy day to a spiral by being on LinkedIn. So luckily I quickly hid that person from my feed from now on, which is a shame because I like their work, but I can't be getting sidetracked in my life into that kind of thing through comparison. And I could also have used the ideas in chapter 4 of this book, of course. But we get into this sense in that book that in that chapter, there's loads of stories in it that we could pick up on, but for time, I think we can leave readers probably to pick that up unless you want to. The kind of principle is the title of the chapter. No one can compete with us at being us, right? So we often choose to compete with people on the things that society tells us we should compete on, or the things that they're really good at. And that's horrible because we lose and it feels miserable. And instead we can compete at the things that we're really good at. And we can choose to believe that if we do that and we put ourselves out in the world, we can position ourselves, and that when we do that and position ourselves as really being us, then that will be good for business because we won't be competing with somebody else on their strengths. And look, so that was partly where the word honor started making its way back into my work. And then by the time I got to this kind of book, I felt like we're inviting. I mean, I took the language higher self. I mean, it's not his language, but it landed for me when I was reading Stephen Pressfield's work. But those words, I think we kind of need them to describe what we are trying to be more of. Like in this work, in this book, it's really hard to, like, I guess as I'm thinking about it now, lots of those words are kind of, be your best self more, but those kind of terms, they don't mean enough and they're kind of a bit overused. I needed some language that would speak to what is possible for us when we're more skillful, when we are at our best more. And so those words, they appeal because a higher self, it has a little spiritual tingle to it, which will put some people off. But if you've been knocking around my writing and you haven't been put off by a tingle of spirituality, yeah, I hope this is what does it. And the idea of being noble, yeah, like that. Isn't it sad that isn't a thing we're all aspiring to be? I mean, I kind of know why, because we're projecting a lot of things onto who the nobility, for example, are in the UK and that kind of thing. But and I had a funny exchange with somebody after I started publishing about honor more, that he just like couldn't get on board with it because he'd heard too. I guess this is me projecting a little bit based on what he said, but I'm pretty sure he was kind of saying, because he's heard too many politicians and judges who he doesn't think of as being honourable, calling each other most honourable sir. And so, and I get that. And my view is always, a bit like with the shadow work we were talking about before, always better to reclaim like what we actually are than to try and hide from it in some way. So I love those words. Wisdom, nobility, honour, higher self. I think they speak a little bit to what we all need a bit more of.
And if we don't reclaim them, then LinkedIn has connection forever.
Exactly, right? I like it.
I'm mindful we've got about 10 minutes. I'll hand over to you, Alex, if you want to bring any more questions as well. But like if there's anything that we've not touched on that's coming up for you, Robbie, that'd be useful to explore.
I mean, look, I think we've done a great job. We've touched on the core ideas in the book. I think we've done, we've accidentally done some good tantalizing for other bits that are in there. I guess we haven't talked much about the relationships chapter. We haven't talked much about part 2 of the book. Maybe that's okay. But if there's anything you two want to pick up on that, that's perfect. I mean, I do want to say a big thank you to Alex Swale, because let me tell listeners a little bit what he did. I can't remember how many people, like I would guess 4 or 5 I think a very early draft of about 15 to 20,000 words for a very specific type of feedback. And I think one other person did it on chapter 1 and then flaked out. And Alex did it for the whole book, giving me this amazing ways to build on what this book has become. And it became an 80,000 word book, which I then cut back in this final round to about 60, which makes it about the length of 3 of the 12-minute method books. So there's a lot more to it than those books. And although it doesn't look that much bigger because there's so many short chapters in those books that they look like bigger books than they are. But yeah, I wanted to say a huge thank you to you, Alex, because it genuinely, I mean, when you read the book, get the book, you'll read it in the back. Maybe was the acknowledgements in there? Did I well, I sent you? It had it in there, right? Like it wouldn't be the book it is without that help. And I also have thought about quite a lot because we have to find our ways to get through the resistance. And I've thought a lot about some of the things you said to me about this book, even quite a long time ago. One of them I remember at a very nice station pub in Sheffield once, what feels like a long time ago, and they do, like, they make it happen. They're a contribution to this. So I wanted to make sure to say thank you to you. I could probably spend another 10 minutes doing that in different ways for this book. But anyone who reads it, there are other people who have made big contributions too. But like, honestly, in this moment, I can't think of anyone who's made a bigger contribution to this book existing than Alex.
Thanks, Robbie. Well, it's been an absolute privilege. And actually, when I was reading through the final version, I was thinking how it was just so. I was about to say it was enjoyable, and it was enjoyable in one hand, but it was also intense because I've mentioned about it being challenging and making me think about stuff. But I was thinking what a real privilege it is to be able to examine our lives in this way. And we talk about this for our work as coaches, perhaps, in the way that we work with people, is that, getting to sort of question the human condition and think about these things and debate them with people is such a joy. And I think that, one thing that I'd really encourage people who read the book is, firstly, obviously, to engage with Robbie's ideas, give feedback, have your own perspectives on it, apply it to your own life. But also that thing around thinking about how do you actually develop your ideas? Because this kind of relates to the last question I want to ask you, which is whether the process of actually writing it helps you to develop your ideas. Because I suppose there's 2 things going on for me. One is it's sort of a codification of things that you were feeling in an embodied sense. And then on the other hand, as you're actually, especially the way to explain these concepts you're feeling to other people. And for me, being at that early stage was such a joy, because it's like, probably back then, if I reread it, I would think compared to this, it feels less polished, much less polished, because you're grappling with those things. And hopefully my feedback gave you some ideas and made you think. And so I'd love to know, apart from thank you so much for kind compliments, is that writing process very important to developing your own understanding? How did you find that?
Yeah, for sure. It became, in this book, it became a, what would we say? Like, it became the thing that I was curious about, right? It became a stress test of these ideas. And yeah, we'd have to check which draft you had and that kind of thing. But I'm sure there will be, there are definitely frameworks, ideas that weren't in that first thing that you read. Stories, the train story probably wasn't in because it happened after, right? Like, there are a bunch of these stories that, as I came back to it, became part of it and solidified. And yeah, it's very important to say a very interesting and valuable, for someone like me, benefit of creating a book and making it a book is that it requires, I found that for me, it requires a level of, like solidity, even though you can update, like, I don't know if people know this, but like, if we find a typo in the book the day after it's done, we can get a new thing uploaded so that the next person who buys it won't have that typo in it, right? So I could change the whole thing and no one would know, unless apart from the people who'd already bought a copy. So it's not solid, but it feels solid, and it feels like there's a rigor that has to go into it. that is different. And that means I have to check, do I actually believe this? This was one of the toughest things on this final redraft. It's like, well, 3 or 4 years has passed. No, maybe 4 or 5 years has passed since I did a proper pass at this. Like, do I still believe everything? Where are the bits that I don't believe it? And those are the awkward rewrite bits. Like, what needs to be updated? And yeah, the idea, and the other thing is, like I kind of mentioned with Jennifer, but there are other ways of explaining these ideas that end up in the book because the first draft was written, and then time passes, and at some point in that time, I'm thinking, wow, I've learned this new thing. You know what? This would be a great thing to factor into that part there. So yeah, look, there's a huge advantage to make it more universal. There's a huge advantage in writing anything that you thoughtfully create. So it could be, I tend to make my videos like I make podcasts, right? Which is we rock up and we do some stuff and we talk and we see what comes. And that does have a value. But something like a book or a video or podcast that you prepare for really carefully, there's something about that is very valuable from exactly like you say, from the process of solidifying these ideas. And yeah, for me, for thinking, okay, what do I really believe? And am I and this is the vulnerability, right? Am I fully committed to these ideas? And if I am fully committed to them and I show this, what is going to happen? What if I'm wrong? What if it's a terrible idea to do these things? I think it's been long enough that I know it's not. But yeah, so I think it's a great question. And from that point of view, it's why I remember years ago, and this is again more 12-minute method type stuff, but hearing Seth Godin say something like, if you write how you think, then if you practice your writing, you're practicing thinking. And if you write how you speak, then if you're practicing writing, you're practicing speaking. And and then if you have a writing practice then where you do that, then every time you're writing, you're practicing thinking and speaking. And that's certainly been true for me. And it's a different beast to try and craft a now 60,000 word book that has, it's hard to hold it. You need a week at a time, basically, to kind of get inside it and then do any meaningful work on it. And that's much harder than doing little blog posts because it's harder to kind of do all that solidifying and thinking about ideas that are more complex and more joined up.
I thought before I hand over to you, Robbie, perhaps to close, when I was looking back through bits of the book today, I actually wanted to pull out the Viktor Frankl quote you used, because it feels like the book is essentially a how-to to that statement, which is that everything can be taken away from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way.
Yeah, I remember, it probably isn't the first time I've heard that quote, probably, but I read it on there's an example of it, the whole thing coalescing, right? I was on a training course and somebody put that up on a slide. And honestly, because I was probably working on this book at the time, it was 2020-ish, so probably had just put that draft stuff out. Maybe 2021, I can't remember. It was quite moving to read it. Because people who don't know, Frankl was in Auschwitz. And so he's experienced pretty much the worst conditions that anyone could ever dream of experiencing. And he, at that point, is still saying, we have freedom to choose our own experience. And yeah, it's moving to think about that, really. And it's why it matters so much. I had this woman who was at the Meaningful Productivity workshops who wrote me this really beautiful message afterwards, telling me a tiny bit at a surface level, some of the really tough stuff she'd been through, and how some of the work we did on the mindset, on the attitude management piece, which is essentially underneath it, this same work we're talking about today, it had changed things straight away. The sense that we can choose our experience, it's a wild idea, truly wild idea. And look, it doesn't fix everything, but that Frankl quote is part of what enables me to say, yes, this worldview is valid, and therefore, yes, this book is worth publishing. Because you get one story like that, right? Like that woman, and it's worth doing. Yeah, so look, everybody, as you said before we started, Alex Whitten, book is available from all good bookshops, I hope, by the time you hear this. Obviously, it's not available from any good bookshops now. I'm not, but I'm not implying that anyone who doesn't stock my book, as you were suggesting I should, Alex, is not a good bookshop. They probably just haven't come across it yet. So you can help them by doing that, everybody, by ordering it. They should be able, any good bookshop should be able to order in this book by the time you're listening to this show. It's been a total pleasure to dive in. Of course, we'll put links to buy it in the show notes and all that kind of thing. And as always, any questions and feedback and reflections gratefully received on the show, on what you'd like us to cover coming up, and on the book. You'll have heard today that it's meaningful for me to hear that, and that, we don't know when we make things what impact they'll have. I'm very grateful to Alex and Alex for reading the book again, in your case, Alex, so that we could have this amazingly rich conversation. This is the first conversation I've had about the book. It may not be the first thing people hear, because we haven't decided when we're going to exactly publish this one yet, but yeah, it's very fresh for me, and I'm looking forward to exploring these ideas more on the show and elsewhere over the coming months. But yeah, mostly thanks, Alex and Alex, and we'll have you, hopefully have you back with us on the show sometime soon. Hi everybody, Robbie here, and just a few quick things to share with you before you go on to the rest of your day. Thanks for getting all the way through the episode. I'm imagining that means you enjoyed it, and you enjoyed the ideas I was sharing in my writing about the power to choose. Of course, I hope you go and buy the book, but if you loved the ideas that we've been talking about today, you might also love something else I've written, my free ebook, An Introduction to the Coaching Business Flywheel. You can get it at thecoachesjourney.com. It's my attempt to boil everything I've learned from my years supporting, coaching, and interviewing coaches about their businesses into one simple model containing the fundamentals of any sustainable coaching business. These are the only things you have to do to have a sustainable coaching business, and the things that if you don't do them, you can't have a sustainable coaching business. You can get it for free at thecoachesjourney.com. And if you are interested in that, you might also be interested in the Coach's Journey community. It's my flexible, affordable group coaching program for coaches. You can pay either £20 or £100 a month and get access to a certain number of group coaching calls a year, plus some one-to-one time with me if you're a full member, and various other benefits too. Both the Alexes have been part of the community at different times, and so if you join, you also get the chance to be connected to other amazing coaches on their own journeys, like Alex, and many other amazing people. You can join and read testimonials and more information and all that kind of thing at thecoachesjourney.com/community. Thanks so much to everyone who's supported the Coach's Journey over the years, but in particular, thank you to Alex Whitten, Alan Bedding, Jessica Jem, Nikki Marsden, Zola Ban, Nat Baldwin, Aiseen Karadaman, Manfred Prafazi, Fionn Rhys-Hughes, Paula, and Rebecca Nosko for your ongoing support. Thank you too for listening, and we hope to have you back with us on the Coach's Journey podcast sometime soon.